I woke early that morning. The sun stood high. No trace of the storm remained. Looking at the ocean from Ross' balcony, everything seemed normal, peaceful, and serene. The cruise missile episode appeared like one of those dreams that come in the night and are quickly forgotten, the kind that one leaves behind when the new day dawns. The tragic episode seemed to have this kind of unreal quality. It had suddenly ended and given way to the real world. It was a warm, clear morning. The sun shone brightly. A perfect calm lay upon the water. And more dreamlike than that had been to find Heather at my side when I woke. We were the first ones up. She had joined me moments later on the balcony. "Is this real?" I asked. I squinted at the sunlight. She just smiled and nodded. I went inside and started the coffee kettle as a diversion, hoping for a chance to sort out my thinking. But without avail. To my delight, she had followed me to the kitchen. With nothing more to do there, we went back to bed for a quick cuddle on the camping mat on the living room floor that I had been sleeping on, waiting for the others to wake up. "I'm terribly sorry for leaving you that day," said Heather. "Nonsense," I replied softly. "You might have saved our lives. I admire your sensitivity to what had been required under the situation back then. It is I who should apologize." She put a hand over my mouth. "Don't apologize." We lay there for a while, silently, smiling at each other. I remembered the times we had spent together like this in the mornings, those precious times. "Did Ross tell you that we are going to be married soon?" She broke the silence. "And then we are going to have a baby." "Hey, that's great news." "And no, Ross didn't say anything about that." "You guys saved the world just for my child," she said, and grinned, "and you didn't even know." "Not me," I said, "it was you who had saved the world." "No, you did that," she repeated. "You got Ross' attention onto the fishing boat." "Yes, but it was only because you and Sylvia were talking about me I wanted to stop that." "You heard everything?" I nodded. "You scoundrel." We developed an argument over this incident that turned into a pillow fight that woke everyone else up. Since Ross had only one double bed that he let Sylvia use, and only one Chesterfield on which he slept himself, it was camping style for the rest of us. Heather and I had chosen to camp in the middle of the living room, while Tony had preferred to sleep on the balcony. "Did you notice how jumpy Ross was last night?" said Heather. At this point we were surveying the world once more from the balcony with our coffees in hand. "He is already behaving a bit like a prospective father," she added. I didn't really have time to answer. I noticed a helicopter approaching from the sea. It touched down on the beach. A man with a baseball cap got off, wearing a bright red jacket. In the view of the binoculars, the man looked remarkably like Fred, my boss, Ferdinand Constantine. Yes, oh yes, it was Fred all right. I should have expected him. But how did he get here so quickly? "Hi Pete," he called out to us as he arrived at the top of the trail to Ross Place. He didn't seem surprised to see me. Obviously, he knew where he could find us. He had been the first to know about the wonderful place that we had bought. He came straight up to the balcony where everyone was enjoying, as we were, our morning coffee. "In the light of what happened last night," he announced to us all, "I have a delicate job for you, and I mean all of you, Ross too. You are about to become tourists." "A special mission?" I asked. Fred nodded. "A very special mission. The president has made up his mind to give the Russians some breathing space. Apparently he had thought about this for some time. Maybe your report from Steve had something to do with that? In any case, last night's incident convinced him that our SDI push is putting too much pressure on the Russians. The SDI development is pushing them into a corner, strategically. He wants to ease that pressure and hopes that this will increase our security." "That's the dumbest I heard yet," I replied. Fred jerked his head around and looked at me as if I had hurt him to the bottom of his soul. "Sure, it's logical what the president wants to do, I said, but is America able to withstand the consequences? He is proposing surrender. No, he is proposing to save our lives, said Fred. Oh, is he? I said. If we hadn't had those high-tech whacks, I reminded him, looking straight into his eye, the cruise missile accident last night might have ushered in the end of the world. I asked him to think about that. Without the SDI we would be totally helpless against a similar accident involving one of their big ICBMs. If you want my help in throwing away the best defense this country has invented, forget it. I spoke angrily. I didn't even give him a chance to reply. I hammered on. I reminded him of how all previous attempts by the Soviet Union have failed to get the SDI killed. Not the most devastating acts of sabotage against the space shuttle system has broken the American devotion to its space activity. What had been destroyed has been rebuilt. We've never given up on our vision that a strong presence in space can deter ICBM warfare. While the SDI cannot create peace, it can make life safer. And the president wants to throw all this away. I almost shouted at Fred. Fred shuddered. I didn't come here to ask for your cooperation. I'm ordering you. You will go on this mission, he said. I shook my head. Then I'll have the deed to your property, said Fred, getting angry now, too. Who do you think sold you that property? Who but the government would give $800,000 worth of property away for 90 grand, and for a nudist beach of all things? Didn't I tell you which realtor to contact? And on top of that, we gave you twice what this beach house of yours was worth. I just wanted to get you near to our surveillance station, and thereby secure the station a bit more. The people that owned the property before you could not be trusted. So we both benefited. But you still owe me, and now I am wondering whether you can really be trusted. Fighting among ourselves doesn't solve anything, Ross intervened. This isn't such a clear-cut issue anyway. Maybe the president is more right than you are, he said to me. Not giving up when the space shuttle system is sabotaged is one thing, but not yielding when the lives of the world are at stake is stupidity. The president may be stupid, but maybe he has no choice in this particular matter. It probably hurts him as much as it does you. He turned to Fred. I feel we should support the president, he said. Then he looked at me again. You wouldn't want to move back into the city? He said. All right, I said quietly, I'll go, but reluctantly. As God is my witness, we are making a big mistake by giving up the SDI. We shouldn't scrap it. We should enlarge it and invite the whole world and the Soviets to participate as equal partners as the project was designed in the first place. Fred grunted something about this being totally impossible and me being an ungrateful bastard. He explained the president's problem to us and his vision, and finally his command as the supreme commander of the nation. The SDI goes, he said, and you will be a part of the process. Diplomacy is needed. Stopping the SDI must never be understood by the Soviets as a sign of weakness. The president feels that the cancellation must be presented to the Soviets in as quiet a manner as is humanly possible. It must be given to them without any strings attached. It must not appear like coercion. He feels that this would make them even more nervous. You want us to present the news to the Soviets? Ross asked, surprised. No, not exactly, said Fred. I think it's a damn smart move, said Tony, giving up that Star Wars thing. It wouldn't work anyway. No, Tony, it would work, said Ross. Except that's of no great importance now, is it? Said Fred. Pete may well be right that it is a stupid thing to do, to shut down the SDI development. I agree that getting the whole world on board as partners, including the Soviets, would be the right way to go. But Pete is not the president, and the president we have is not smart enough to implement what really needs to be done. Unfortunately, he is the president. The decision has been made by him as the president and the supreme commander of the United States of America to surrender the SDI. That's not debatable. Only the how to do it is debatable. It doesn't even matter anymore whether the SDI would or would not work. In any case, the Russians have always believed that the SDI is feasible. That's why they are scared of it. In my position, I must support the president who wants to remove the cause for that fear. I cannot dismiss the president. I have to obey him. I have to do my best to make his plan work. The Soviets have been hopping mad ever since we announced the SDI. They have done everything in their power to bring it to a halt. Believe me, the SDI can be made to work, Ross repeated. In any case, the Soviets are building one of their own. The undeniable fact is that whoever owns it first controls the world. The Russians are scared that the SDI might give us the lead for a preemptive strike against them, said Fred. The president simply wants to stop this mad race for gaining control over the world. He also feels that this race might have forced the Soviets into putting a greater emphasis on deploying cruise missiles that can penetrate any defense system, as they have demonstrated they can. The president wants to give the Soviets room so that they can find a way to get off our back. He is looking for a foundation to develop a greater sense of unity between our two nations in order to end the Cold War conflict. He wants peace instead of inviting domination. That's an honorable goal, I said. But will the Soviets get off our back? Will they feel the power of this principle and respond in kind? Will they see it as an offer based on the principle of universal love? Do they even know about this principle? I stared Fred in the face as I said this, to watch for his reaction. Also, why must it be us, personally, who must tell the Soviets about our surrender, our gift? Fred stepped back and turned away from me. He explained to Ross that we wouldn't actually do it ourselves. The president's plan was that we would go to East Germany and contact my friends in Leipzig and have them pass on the message. Fred reminded me as he spoke that Steve and Ushi were highly sensitive persons and would therefore be ideally suited, especially Steve as a world-renowned scientist. And Ushi too, as a respected journalist, Sylvia added. Ex-journalist. I corrected her. I told Fred that I would never get my friends involved in such a scheme. Without even giving them the chance to choose for themselves. Ross interrupted. Didn't Steve practically offer his services with that bold talk about flooding the world with love, starting a new era, creating a new world? Said Fred. And you said the same thing just a few days ago. How soon you forget. Moments later Fred added that it didn't matter anyway what our personal feelings were, we should do our best to get those people involved in this, because after all, Steve had already involved himself in a big way with his daring report that attacked the president personally. This means that Steve is involved. He became involved from the day that report was written. And as for us, Fred said, that as long as we worked for the diplomatic service, personal feelings have no place in that matter. The point is, he yelled at me finally, your friends are among the few people we have a close contact with who know how the job is done in the East, who have high-level connections in the Soviet Union, and appear honest enough to be believed. Those people are hard to find, especially the honest ones. When you come in contact with people like that, you don't just strike pay dirt, you strike solid gold. That's what happened to you in Leipzig. Who else has a private network of academic friends that's stretching deep into the Soviet Union to the highest places, as it appears their networks do? We also have confirmation that your girl in the East is an excellent journalist and might well be the most ideal person we know to pass the message on to Moscow in a way that won't be misunderstood. So I suggest you better follow the orders that I am giving you, and trust me for once, even if you can't see the logic right now. It isn't right trying to use Pete's friends as pawns in a game that you want to control, Ross interrupted Fred. That's far more dangerous than the worst razzmatazz our own news media would whip up. If you want to look honest, you have to be honest. Right. There has never been a worse time for messing up than this, Heather supported Ross. All you have to do is invite this Ursula and Steve to a public meeting where the announcement is going to be made, Fred pleaded with us. Invite them to where? I asked sharply. Venice, said Fred. To Venice? For the physicists' conference? Asked Ross. Fred nodded. A U.S. delegate will quietly put the word out during a lecture, something to the effect that the United States directed energy beam weapons program has been cancelled. You will have to explain that this has been done in order to increase the nation's security by softening its relationship with the Soviet Union. All you have to do is send a chronic complainer to the conference, I suggested, and he will pass the word to the Soviets so fast. You don't need us to surrender the USA, on a platter, said Ross. Let somebody else do this dirty work. Fred began to laugh. I am looking at the world champions of the chronic complainers right now. He continued laughing. It was at this point, right in the heat of the battle, that a thought hit me. It caused a great upwelling of shame. I could feel tears forming in my eyes. I had been lying to myself and to everyone else, as the man in the airplane would have pointed out. We were fighting one another just like countries were fighting each other. This wasn't a fit platform for ending a war. Also, what we yelled at each other for suddenly came to light as a total denial of the principle of natural unity, the fundamental principle that defines God and man as one in being. It demands one to recognize that there is but one I or us, that we are all children of a single humanity. This all-embracing unity in the singularity of our common human soul may be the foundation for the principle of universal love, I thought. I looked at Fred, at Ross. What are we fighting about? Let's stop this right here, I said to Ross. Fred doesn't deserve this kind of response from us. Let's think this through. I have known Fred for a long time. He is an intelligent person. We must give him credit for that, and listen to what he has worked out. Maybe he has thought of something that we should have thought of a long time ago, but didn't. Building an active defense against nuclear missiles is a great idea, I'm all for it, but maybe Fred has something in mind that can make us more secure under the present circumstances. We should have scrapped the XB-70 Valkyrie before the Soviets developed surface-to-air missiles, Tony interjected. I nodded. It seemed that Fred understood what Tony was saying. I agree with Fred that we need something concrete to put onto the table for the Soviets, and that this has to be done tomorrow, if not today, to assure that there won't be another cruise missile attack. The Soviets have demonstrated that they have a strong card. They invited us to play our card. The SDI is the only card that we've got to put onto the table. And how much is it worth under the circumstances? The whole geometry of the game changed last night. The SDI wouldn't have helped us one bit last night, even if it had been fully operational. Neither can we debate the president. That option is no longer open. We have missed the boat on that one, too. Maybe what Fred suggests is the only peace offer we can make to Russia. Under the present circumstances, that really means something that can elevate the entire peace process onto a higher level in spite of all the constraints. If this is so, I want to be a part of it. I have always tried to contribute a higher level viewpoint, or a higher level idea, in whatever situation I became involved in. I have not always been successful, mind you, but that is what we must do. We must endeavor to raise the bar. We must give it our best shot. If we don't, we become slaves to the mediocrity of popular opinions, whether there is any truth in them or not. Suddenly, everyone was quiet. Ross nodded. Heather smiled, which I took for a yes. Sylvia said that this approach was fundamentally sound. Tony said that the SDI appeared to him just like the XB-70 Valkyrie did, the finest airplane ever built that should have never been built. He explained to Fred that the superior performance of the Valkyrie had boxed the Soviets in, which had made matters worse, a lot worse. Fred appeared to be stunned by the sudden change in our attitude, especially the change in my attitude. He was also determined not to let this show, if he could help it. As if nothing had happened at all, he continued on to explain his plan. I thought your friends could convey this delicate issue in far more ideal terms, said Fred, to me in the same tone of voice as before. I don't want you to use them, he said. I just want to make sure that the best people are involved in the process, and I believe your friends would love to be involved in this historic attempt by the United States of America to do something right for a change." Ross nodded his agreement. "Also, if your lady friend is as good a journalist as I've been told she is, verifying your reports, she may even ask for an on-site visit to one of the labs that are going to be shut down," said Fred. "This could be the opportunity of a lifetime for a freelancer," Ross added. He turned to Fred. "It looks more and more like this might work. What's more important, it would fit within the framework of what the president wants to pursue," said Fred. "The problem is, the meeting starts in less than a week," said Ross, "which doesn't leave us much time to get things organized." "Oh, you will have enough time if you leave today," Fred grinned. "Transportation has already been arranged." He began to laugh now. "I knew you would see it my way." He stood up from the coffee table that we'd all gathered around and went to the telephone. Then he added while he dialed, "I wonder who the real diplomat is among us. Is it the one standing?" he said, and laughed. When he came back, he told us that we would be leaving at 3 in the afternoon. A float plane would pick us up at the beach. Ross and I looked at one another. "You must be joking," said Ross. "We can't just jump up and leave." "Sure, we can," I assured him. "In an emergency like this we have no choice." "Naturally, your ladies are invited to join you," Fred grinned, and stuck his hands in his pockets, and brought a pipe and tobacco out. "I want everybody at this meeting who understands the seriousness of the situation, who has experienced this nightmare firsthand. Nobody else will be inclined to understand the priorities. And even you will likely waver," he said to me, "but not all of you together. So you must all go, as a team. That's the only way this can work. Just make sure you'll be ready on time. The Air Force will fly you to Washington. From there, you'll be on the overnight commercial flight to Paris. From Paris you'll be booked on the first available local flight to Tempelhof in West Berlin. The rest you can arrange for yourselves. You may want to rent a car. All the passports that you'll need will be given to you in Berlin. Check in at the Hilton, and you'll find them waiting for you." After this, Fred addressed Tony, telling him that he was now assigned to the diplomatic service as a liaison with the Air Force for special transportation requirements. That, too, was prearranged. "As you can see, the job has top priority. So get going," he said to us. "Get yourself ready." We sat there and looked at each other. Heather grinned. Sylvia nodded and probably wondered whether this was real or just another dream. I looked at my watch. It was 11 o'clock. "Get going, you guys. You don't have much time to waste," Fred spurred everybody on. While the girls cleared the table, I took Fred aside onto the balcony and asked his forgiveness for my stubborn behavior. I showed him the oil slick on the beach. "I expected nothing less from you," Fred replied. "Your reactions were exactly like mine when this assignment was given to me, except I didn't have the option to yell back at the president. Actually, I expected more opposition from you. I expected more fire, more of your usual passion for what you know is right. Why did you surrender so soon? What happened?" I gave him the field glasses and pointed into the direction where we had seen the oil and debris. "Little of it was left by then. This is the evidence that tells me that all of this is terribly real," I replied. This is precisely what Steve had warned us about. If this had been cooked up in the Kremlin, Steve would have known about it. He had warned us about the unseen, the hidden movements by the little stooges in high places who do the bidding of empire for a few shillings. This was a covert operation for which the Russian military was hijacked and abused. They blew up the boat that launched the missile and even shot the survivors. This would not have happened if this had been on the level. The question now is, how will the leaders in the Kremlin respond to the provocation that was as much directed against them as it was directed against us? While I was yelling at you, The idea dawned that it may yet be the sanest response on our part to put some water onto the fire to cool things down as much as possible. In view of this evidence, I suddenly realized that I must support the president. The SDI is a great idea, Fred. It is founded on the principle of universal love. It is designed to uplift and protect the whole of humanity, but it is only useful when the principle that it is founded on is recognized and acknowledged and implemented. The universe is indivisible. No one exists outside of it. Our humanity is indivisible likewise. No one exists outside of it either. Empire and its war against mankind stand in denial of this reality. The SDI principle is designed to counteract this denial. We seem to have forgotten that its principle is an invitation to the whole of mankind to join hands in developing the technology that can offer a measure of defense for all mankind against this ultimate form of war. Unfortunately, the invitation has been rejected, whereby its founding principle has been scrapped. This means that the SDI no longer really exists. What exists now under its name is the opposite. It's a perversion. It stands on the mythological platform of a divided humanity. It stands on the same platform as war itself, that of dividing the indivisible. If this is what you propose to scrap, I gladly participate. Ultimately, the SDI question isn't an technological question, said Fred, in a matter-of-fact kind of tone. It would have been totally useless at the start if it had been merely a technological question. Technologically, it would take a decade to get the SDI technology installed and to get it to work. It takes time to create these advanced space defense systems based on new physical principles that have not been discovered yet. That's too far distant for the current situation, and it was that at the very beginning. But as a principle that puts all mankind onto a single platform, with no one standing outside, it had the power to change the global strategic atmosphere and eradicate war and what is causing it. That's the only way it could have worked. You are perfectly correct, Peter, that this was scrapped before it even got off the ground, and was replaced with the opposite. We have missed the boat on this one. Now we have to deal with the failure. We missed the boat all right, on this one, like we are determined now to miss the boat again in preparing the world for the coming ice age. That might hit us 100 years from now, I said to Fred. We should be developing the infrastructures for indoor agriculture, starting right now. But we don't. We should have developed the SDI 2 decades ago. It might have worked then. It really is too late now. The world is too deeply ruled by empire now. We need a real defensive system, and we had needed it yesterday. We need something concrete, today, tomorrow at the very latest. I have come to realize while we yelled at each other that we need to achieve a major breakthrough in the next few days that will keep us all from killing each other with nuclear bombs. It's like the Ice Age transition has already begun in strategic terms. We have to face what is happening. If it takes 100 years to prepare our world for the Ice Age transition, then the way we are going right now where nothing is being built will be a death sentence for mankind in the future as the result of our inaction today. Indoor agriculture takes 100 years to develop and construct. Luckily for us lazy slobs, it doesn't take a huge physical infrastructure to stop nuclear war. We don't need anything like the SDI. We can destroy the global nuclear stockpile in a week, if we decide to do it. All we need is a change in thinking, in terms of our attitude towards one another. I see we understand each other, Peter, said Fred, and nodded. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. War and peace is a wide and complex field, but basically it's that simple. In principle, it is. I know this, Peter, but without a foundation established, peace is immensely challenging. There is something that you might not have considered, Fred, I continued. During my last mission into communist Germany, I met a woman who had discovered a profound principle during a process of healing. She had a friend in hospital undergoing an extensive surgery. She knew that he had a weak heart. She had determined that when the time came she would support him mentally to the best of her ability, like sending him all the light and love that she could in his hour of trial. Except what happened instead surprised her. As if the message had been conveyed to her, she sensed an overwhelming urgency a short time after the operation was to begin. She was touched by this powerful, urgent sense for a need for more strength. At this moment of the unfolding great urgency, there was no time left for scientific reasoning. She pulled together mentally all that she knew, and all that she had discovered before, all the principles that she was aware of. As she did this, an amazing graphic construct developed in her mind. She saw before her a huge geometric construct unfolding, of a lattice of countless human hearts, all arranged laterally, all standing by each other, side by side, supporting one another, linked to one another by countless strands of love that illumined the whole lattice. She saw in this image before her the very process of love in action. She observed and witnessed an amazing process in which each of the countless human hearts was contributing a bit of its strength to still her friend's need. The woman said that after a while of observing this process, the mental scene gradually became quiet again. However, some time later, and quite suddenly again, she felt the previous sense of urgency upwelling once more, and responded to in the same manner. This happened 3 times in a row. 3 times she witnessed, as if she were an observer, the rich functioning of this lateral lattice of love. Then, almost as suddenly as she had sensed the urgency before, she felt a great peace unfolding. That happened nearly an hour before the surgery was supposed to have been completed. Evidently, the need had been fully satisfied at this point, so that the crisis was overcome. This surprised her. But the real surprise came later the same day in late afternoon, when she visited her friend in hospital. She found him sitting up in bed, beaming with a sense of joy and victory in his smile. This should not have been possible for someone who had just come out of major surgery only hours before. But it happened. Are you saying that this might be the platform to stop nuclear war? Fred interrupted. More than that, Fred. It could hold the key to end all war. The key here, again, is that there is no outside possible in the universe of our humanity. What she saw appears to be the natural platform of human existence. It appears to me that staging wars becomes inevitable when this platform becomes destroyed in human thinking, or is disabled with irrational ideologies, like the ideologies of fascist hate that Hitler forced onto the German agenda, or fascist greed that Adam Smith raised up in the world as we find it thick and heavy in America. The lattice breaks down in an atmosphere of hate and greed and indifference, which all seem to be the same in essence, and they all open the floodgates to war, and I mean permanent war. That is why empires, which embrace all of these, also embrace permanent war. War is in their blood, so to speak. War happens naturally when the lateral lattice of universal love is disabled. War becomes extremely likely when this happens. And that is where we are today. So, the obvious choice to do away with what disables the lateral lattice of universal love, and let humanity heal itself. What has been lost of it can be reclaimed again with the principle of universal love gaining ground in people's thinking. That means uplifting our thinking to higher ground, to a higher level of perception of the wonders and the strength of our humanity. Fred raised his hand to stop me. So you have come to your senses, said Fred, and smiled. I remembered this when we were yelling at each other. I said to Fred, it is easy to overlook the most obvious in the heat of the battle. But that is where it is most urgently needed, Peter, in the heat of the battle, said Fred. That's why I think we need to take it to Venice, Fred. The SDI isn't the real issue at all in Venice. The principle of universal love is the real issue. It's the substance of peace. The SDI wouldn't be able to deliver the substance even if we had it right now. As I said to Tony during the air show when we were discussing the XP-70 Valkyrie, it is impossible to create a technological solution for a problem that isn't a technological problem. That's what I am hoping to bring to the table in Venice. I am hoping to bring the beginning of a real solution, honestly presented, tied up with red ribbons, and sealed with a kiss. Maybe this is what the president is trying to bring to the table. This offer doesn't come from the president, Pete. It comes from his advisors. from the presidency that I am a part of. You realize, of course, that the physicists will yell at you, Pete, when you take their baby away from them that they spent countless sleepless nights struggling to make a reality. I understand they made some amazing progress already in searching for new physical principles for our defensive system. Sure they have, Fred, but we don't have the decade it would take to make the SDI a reality. And even then, as it is envisioned, it will be just another Valkyrie. I know that, said Fred quietly. I also know that you will have to educate them somehow to get the academic elite to understand what the real principle for peace and life is. The principle for peace was built into the SDI concept originally. This part has been scrapped. The underlying idea was to get the whole world working together on this. This was the primary goal of the real SDI idea. We were in the process of waking up to the real principle for peace, the principle of the universal brotherhood of all mankind. This scared the warmongers like nothing ever had. They know that nuclear war is in no nation's interest. Only a few mad imperials want nuclear war, who aim to rule the whole world with the terror of their bombs. We should never have started this SDI thing alone, I added. Of course, Peter, nor had we intended to. I believe the original intent was to make this a joint US/Soviet project to begin with, for the benefit of all mankind. But this was wrecked. Someone coerced the Soviets to wreck it. As it stands today, the SDI is a perfect recipe for giving us the power to rule the world ourselves, Fred, and that's the worst thing we could be aiming for. So the best thing we can do is to scrap it and to table a real solution, and this time not through the back door, but honestly, tied up with love and red ribbons. That's the realization that I woke up to. Let's hope it is not already too late for that, said Fred. We've pushed the Soviets into a corner, terribly. We opened a flank that enabled the forces of Empire to react and put us all into danger. And now, the Soviets may feel that they have to react. Of course they feel they must react, I interjected. But how do our own people react? How do they see this thing from last night? Do they see it as a Soviet operation? If so, who did shut down our air defense system during those critical hours? Who made sure that the cruise missile would not be detected? NORAD should have seen this thing and should have instantly contacted Ross for verification. It should have been NORAD that alerted Langley Base instead of Tony's girlfriend. Why didn't the normal channels function? Fred put a finger over my lips. Hush, Peter. In this case, Tony soured somebody's soup, and it was I who told him to do it. Fred repeated the gesture. Hush, Peter, you mustn't talk like that. The official version is that any sane nation with the capacity to prevent the ultimate crisis would have acted as the Soviets have acted. The official version is that this was just a warning shot across the bow, nothing more. I know, Fred, I replied quietly. This isn't meant to add up, is it? The Russians blowing up their own boat afterwards doesn't fit the official version at all. I added moments later, saying to Fred that I was ashamed of the way I had spoken to him before. So, Fred, I figured we'd better start something that takes us to a higher level of thinking instead of yelling at each other. I think the necessary breakthrough can only be made by creating a sense of unity that is built on something real in terms of fundamental principles. The SDI was designed to become a defense system. That is all it would ever be. We need something much greater than that, something that shuts down the conflict for which defenses are needed. We need to create a feeling of unity that has a more solid foundation than the SDI. The unity among humanity needs to have a real foundation. You may call it a divine principle, or the principle of the universe, or the principle of our humanity. It needs to be something imperative by its own substance, something that works, that can never be revoked, something that is common to all people. However, before our advance towards unity can mean anything, three elements must be brought out in conjunction, which are respect, honor, and affection. Without these, unity has no meaning. I paused, but Fred motioned me to go on. I learned this from a man in an airplane on my last trip to Europe, I continued. He told me that if a single one of these three elements is missing, nothing can be achieved in terms of unity. In our confrontation with the Soviets, all three elements have been missing throughout the entire Cold War. Is it any wonder that we are facing nuclear war confrontation? They peeled our skin away and saw that there was nothing beneath it. Our nakedness was our emptiness. They saw no humanity there that they could trust. The way I come to see it, we are in an emergency situation right now. Because of that, we have to do something meaningful on this front, and fast. If last night's hit was a part of an imperial game, we need the Soviets on our side, not against us. Maybe we can do something in Venice to get that shift started. It also appears to me that the president's offer contains to some degree all of the three elements that are needed. It took me a while to recognize that. So, please tell the president he has my full support for his plan. Also tell him that I firmly believe that the nuclear war game isn't controlled by Russia or by America, but is really somebody else's game, in which Russia and America have been set up to play the role of self-sacrificial victims. If the Russians and us can accept this, then we have established a common ground upon which to nurture respect for each other and honor, even affection. Then, we may at last have started to fight the real enemy that isolates us, that divides us, that bids us to destroy one another for its gain. Do you really expect me to tell this to the president? Said Fred. Yes, Fred, I replied. It is needed. But would he listen? That I doubt. You would likely be wasting your breath. Fred took me aside to the far corner of the balcony, quietly. He leaned over the railing as if he was looking for something. You are getting warm, he said in a soft and serious tone. Tell me, he said, if a short-range ballistic missile were to be launched tomorrow from a submarine 200 miles offshore, directed against the United States of America, forgetting what happened last night, whose missile would that most likely be? Would the missile be Russian, French, British, or Chinese? I shrugged my shoulders. No one will ever know the answer to that, I replied to him. No one would know, even if it happened in broad daylight with the whole nation watching it on TV. Those who launched it wouldn't launch it with a billboard attached, advertising the country of origin, except perhaps to mislead everybody. Once launched, those missiles all look the same, with small variations perhaps that one wouldn't see from a distance, certainly not on TV, and definitely not in the middle of the night. These missiles all behave the same. The missile in question could have been launched by any country, or by any institution that has submarines or the power to control one, including Israel, especially Israel. You are right on this one, Fred replied. Israel is on the fast track to becoming the foremost fascist power on the planet, with the fourth largest arsenal of nuclear weapons at its fingertips, if not the third largest. Israel is being groomed to take over from Russia and be the nuclear trigger of last resort. Russia may be too unwilling to comply with the imperial's plan to set the world on fire, in which Russia, the USA, India, and China are targeted to be eliminated. Mark my word, Russia will be replaced as the sacrificial trigger. It appears that Israel has been chosen to become that. There is a shift being prepared in Cold War policies from the adversarial stance, which has failed, onto a friendly stance that is more likely to succeed. According to my contacts in Britain, Israel is the one to watch. It is being set up right now as the empire's Trojan horse to ideologically take over the U.S. government, supplanting itself in all key positions from where to stoke the fires of war. The Israelis have been in love with fascism ever since they became a country, and long before that. In fact, this love affair started long before the Second World War. Their Jabotinsky movement, or whatever it was called, would have loved the Israelis to join Hitler, except Hitler had made that impossible. It would have interfered with his anti-Semitic ambition. Jabotinsky personally fought the Ottomans in Palestine as far back as World War I, for his ambition to establish a Jewish state on both sides of the Jordan River, with the Palestinians being driven out and scattered about. The British loved him for that, because this policy meant permanent war, which is a cherished imperial policy. Fred stopped and laughed. "There is one thing that a friend in Britain has taught me," said Fred, in his laughter, "and he has taught me well, namely that the empire has no permanent allies, only a permanent objective. The objective is to establish a private world empire of the type that H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell had defined for the public to soften the ground. In their utopian world empire, the institution of the nation-state has no place as a rival institution to the global empire. Such a complete imperial takeover can only be achieved by means of permanent war. The present empire's long-term desire has always been that the world's nation-states will be destroyed, especially the United States of America, which has been an eyesore for the empire ever since it was born. For 200 years the empire has tried to destroy the USA, from within, first economically, then socially, and now politically. They are at the point today that they are doing it with ease, with their masterful perversion of democracy. The platform of democracy is easily abused for this purpose. And once democracy has been broken, the next step will be to usher in what the masters of empire called a post-Westphalian world, the world without sovereign nations, the world reeling under the dictatorial governance of supranational imperial looting institutions. Then all nations will become their slaves, without recourse, and without the means to resist. Democracy, while we still have it, can be easily abused if it is not actively defended by society, I interjected. I told Fred that Steve insisted that democracy means taking responsibility, first and foremost. That's precisely what the judicial murder of Socrates in ancient times illustrates, said Fred. No one took responsibility to defend their humanity. Everybody stood back and allowed Socrates to be killed. Just think, Pete, if Socrates, the foremost patriot of humanity, the champion of reason and scientific perception, who personified the very best in humanist development in the ancient world, was so easily murdered, and legally so, by the Democratic Party of Athens, what chance do the people in the USA have? America has become so small-minded, so gullible, and so easily bought. Who even talks about taking responsibility for the general welfare of society? No one does anymore. The executioners have the freedom of the city. The art of democratic murdering has become a fine art in today's imperial world. In fact, our society has been conditioned to kiss the feet of its executioners. There is no true patriotism left in our country. The sad fact is also reflected in the ruling echelon. The very notion of real humanist patriotism has all been destroyed. Greed rules the nation now, not love or brotherhood, or even humanity, as America's hundreds of thousands of homeless can tell you. So I ask you again, Peter, whose missile would it likely be that would be launched against America, in the hypothetical scenario that I gave you? Would the missile be Russian, Chinese, British, Israeli, French, Italian, Indian, Pakistani? I shrugged my shoulders. Who would one retaliate against in such a case? That's the point, Fred replied. Would the president hit Russia? Or China, or both together, including anybody else that's on the imperial hit list? I said cautiously. He would have 3 minutes to choose. Washington could be targeted. Would he retaliate blindly against everyone who has nuclear weapons, or might be suspected of having some, and wipe out the whole world? It doesn't take much of a crazy man to press the buttons of this global destruction. We have been breeding small-minded crazy politicians for years, I added in a tone of a sudden awesome recognition. That's the point, Fred repeated. So I ask again, whose missile would it likely be? Who would love to see Russia, China, and the USA to destroy one another? Who keeps pushing for depopulation? Who has been our country's enemy from the day it was born? Who has been wrecking our economy with feudalism and related notions? Who is looting it, even as we speak? Who has made us the most hated nation in the world? Who has pushed us into becoming synonymous with genocide? Who worked against us from the moment that Franklin Roosevelt died? Who overturned Roosevelt's plans to free the world from colonialism and develop it economically? Who keeps blabbering that the empire has no permanent allies, only a permanent objective? So Pete, My friend, whose submarine would most likely launch a missile against the United States of America. Answer my question, please. The Russians are not the most dangerous enemy that we have, by any stretch of the imagination, as you can tell. Nor are the Chinese our enemy. China has never attacked another nation in its entire history. The Chinese are as much in danger as we are. So, whose sub would launch such a missile? You know the answer as well as I do, I replied. I couldn't even bring myself to spell out the name of the country that Fred had described. You may be wrong, Fred cautioned me. It won't likely be a British submarine, as you might suspect from all the evidence that I gave you, because the evidence also fits someone else. Fred paused. The British, actually, don't operate that way, he added. That's not their style. Their style has always been to get other people to do their dirty work for them. So, I ask again. In which direction does the compass point? Who carries out the dirtiest operations in the world? The Israelis, I replied cautiously. Fred nodded. That's a possibility fast in the making, but that's not likely today. They have the hardware to do it. Also, they are committed lackeys of the British Emporium, but there is a greater likelihood for such an act to be carried out by somebody other than the Israelis. Who is more fascist? Who has already killed many times more people around the world in recent years than the Israelis have killed in their entire history? Who has made the population a part of its foreign policy? Who wants to eliminate not millions, but billions of people for imperial goals? I shrugged my shoulders. I give up, Fred. Look at the tip of your forefinger, said Fred. Who does it point to? It points to me, to us. Do you suggest that we could be doing such a thing to ourselves? That's insane, I said. You must be insane to believe this. And that is the reason why it will likely happen that way, said Fred calmly. The more insane a plan is, the more likely it will succeed, because the gullible public would never believe that we would ever do such a thing against our own people, intentionally. That's why they'll do it if we don't shut this madness down. In the imperial world, the concept of a nation, or national allegiance, doesn't exist. It makes no difference to them where a city is located that they determine must be destroyed to get their wars started. This simply means that it is more efficient for them to do this on their home ground, especially if it opens the door for them to go after their real objective. That's how things are done in the imperial world, Peter. Self-provocation is the modern way to start a war or to change a nation overnight. That's especially true if you have become the foremost fascist power in the world by design, because no one took the responsibility to prevent it. Naturally, the more unbelievable the imperial interventions are, the more likely they will succeed, because nobody believes that people will do these things. That way nobody suspects anything. That's how covert operations are run, Peter. It is our own people's design to do this. We've done this several times already. We had planned to do this in a big way during the Cuban crisis. Fortunately, the planned self-provocation had failed, because the president found out about it. We did it again later during the Gulf of Tonkin affair. We did this one with a whole bunch of blatant lies. We are under attack, our people cried. We are under attack. But there was no attack. It was a self-provoking lie. In fact, it almost becomes necessary these days to launch any war that way, because it takes months of tedious work to prepare the logistics for a war. You need the trigger for war precisely timed with when you're ready. It's always been that way. Obviously, if you need such a big trigger precisely timed, you've got to do it yourself. And it's easily done, Peter. You go out and hire a stooge. You pay him well, but you run the operation. Last night's cruise missile might have been such a case, with the Russians being the stooge. Or if you dare, you run the self-provocation entirely by yourself. Fred scolded me suddenly. I must have shaken my head. Don't look at me so innocently. It is our nation that I am talking about. You are a part of it. You have allowed this to develop. You are the culprit together with everybody, by default. We are all in this mess to our neck, until we clean it up. I shook my head again. No, Peter, we are a part of this nation, and the mess that we made stinks. What do you think we built nuclear bombs for? If you're in the game and you play it at this high-minded, arrogant level where these games are played, you don't think in terms of human beings anymore. Why then, would you be concerned about a few people of your own nation, or in your own cities? Especially if you're told that the world is woefully overpopulated. The moment you become trapped into the imperial sphere, your humanity becomes destroyed by corruption. Suddenly you find that human life isn't an important factor anymore. The imperial goals will become your soul. I raised my hand to stop him. Fred just laughed. We've all been corrupted, said Fred. Haven't we been told day after day that human beings are a cancer on the earth? Isn't that what the propaganda machine grinds out in countless different ways? Are you surprised when some people suddenly become motivated by the imperial plan to fix that by the benign imperial objective? The imperials have always been high-minded. They always saw themselves standing miles above society. But now society is playing the same role. This is the modern culture now, a culture tailor-made for warfare. We have been dragged into this cultural warfare over the last 200 years and have become infected by it. To some degree, the whole world has become infected by it. We are now able to do the dirtiest deeds with ease. We steal, enslave, torture, kill, or simply starve people to death, or kill them with diseases that could be easily prevented. We have created this murderous capacity ever since we have lost our cultural backbone by embracing fascism, as we do. In the fascist world, a person's humanity no longer stands in the way, because there is none left. That is what our society has largely become, a shiny shell of empty people singing fascist songs of war, and looting and slavery. I protested. No, Peter, that is the truth, Fred protested in return. I can give you all the evidence you need. You find this evidence in every city throughout the country. You find it in what you can find. Where are the protesters against this cultural war that is destroying America? Where are the protesters against the genocide that America has heaped on Africa in the spirit of an SSM 200? Where are the citizens standing in the streets demanding the elimination of nuclear weapons in America? We rail against every country in the world that has them, while we are building more and more of them. Where are the demands for a new and just world economic order that should be foremost on people's mind because it is essential for their survival? All of these things will begin when we see each other as human beings, I interjected. Fred nodded. When will this be, Peter? What is our nation voting for at election time by choosing the kind of people we have put into positions of power decade after decade, who are totally unqualified for the job? We have elected presidents, congressmen, and senators that have collectively ruined our country. They've done this for decades because they've been elected for being too stupid to know that they are playing lackeys to somebody else. And society is even more stupid to be going along with that. We have more stringent criteria in place for hiring gas pump attendants than we have for electing presidents and the various leaders of the nation. I just shrugged my shoulders. Right, Pete. Just shrug your shoulders. That's what everybody does. Everybody shrugs those shoulders instead of shouldering the needed responsibility for the nation and mankind. That's why these awful things happen, like self-provocation into war. It's become a near universal thing. In any case, this is the most likely scenario that I can think of when a provocation is needed by the empire to force us into something big. What happened last night doesn't fit this general pattern as I read the larger game, or else it would have succeeded. What happened last night was a setup for something bigger that you and Tony have spoiled. They didn't count on an asymmetric response. They failed to consider the little guys, the daring patriots, that still know to react intelligently. They launched this thing right over the top of our tracking station and left a footprint to show that they did so. They probably planned to fly this thing right across Washington, undetected, and then take out Baltimore. Obviously, the empire stood behind the whole thing. Somebody pushed the Soviets. And to prove to them that America had taken its defenses down to accommodate the project, they allowed the Soviets to penetrate deep into U.S. waters, unchallenged. It is highly likely that our own country had a hand in this. How else would it have been possible for the Soviets to come so close to shore? Alarm bells should have been ringing hours before this happened. The president understands that much. He doesn't understand, however, who and what stands behind it. The empire wants a regime change in Russia. A close-call nuclear war would have brought this about. With Baltimore wiped off the map as a shot across the bow, and our defenses being discredited at the same time, our country would have exploded in fear and rage so that anything would have been possible, which only a total Russian surrender might have stopped, ending in regime change. The imperials want a regime change in Russia. They want to change from an adversarial basis to a democratic basis. It is easier for the imperials to loot the continent on a democratic basis. It is also easier on a democratic basis to integrate Russia into their imperial setup for the larger destruction of mankind in permanent war, for permanent control. I raised my hand. That's a wild conspiracy theory, I interjected. That's the only one that fits all the facts, Peter. That goes slightly beyond diplomacy, I agree. Unfortunately, such are the games that are being played. What happened last night wasn't about Russia or America, it was about gaining control, to loot Russia and Asia. It was about breaking up the Soviet Empire and all of Asia. It was about setting the stage for endless wars until all opposition to empire ends, and a new renaissance will never be possible anywhere in the world. I raised my hand again, to object. The Soviets would have never complied. They would have had no choice. The Soviet system would have been taken down from within by the resulting scandal and the American threat. The Soviets would never surrender, I said. They would sooner go down in a nuclear war and take America down with them. That would serve the imperials just as well, said Fred. Don't forget, America is their number one enemy, except when it is needed as a useful fool. That's the special relationship that we have with the imperials. They call America their friend because America has created for them the most powerful, the most secretive, and the dirtiest covert operations capability in the world, set up by the foremost masters of the craft, infiltrated from the midst of the empire itself. This capability, with some pretty twisted rouge elements among them, is needed for America to fulfill its assigned role as a strong-arm lackey. Anything else is secondary. America has become the imperials' playground. Not even our presidents are safe in our own country, as history has shown, if they don't play along. Are you going to tell this to the president? I asked. You must be joking, Fred replied. He wouldn't understand a word of it. It's too unbelievable what is happening here. That's why conspiracies have always worked so well through the centuries. And that is why they are still being pursued, full steam ahead. Our government spends over $25 billion per year in covert operations. The whole thing is run on a platform of conspiracies. Look at Iran. We've taken a democratically elected government and ripped it out and installed the Shah. It wasn't done with military force, but with conspiracies. When the Shah became too progressive, we ripped out the Shah and brought the mullahs back. None of that was done with diplomacy. That's how Africa was wrecked, with conspiracies. For $25 billion a year you can buy a lot of conspiracy actions. And it is all happening under the table, and some of it's so vile that no one would believe it. I still can't believe that American financiers, through the Bank of England, financed Hitler into power in order to prevent the Roosevelt economic renaissance from taking root in Europe and Asia. It was a massive dirty conspiracy that brought Lautenbach down, who represented the American system of economy, and would have uplifted Europe and Asia with it. Hitler was financed into power to prevent this from ever happening again. Had Lautenbach remained, the resulting renaissance would have ended imperial rule. The empire responded with staging war. War is the platform of empire. perpetual empire means perpetual war. None of that is really believable, but it all happened. Fred paused and laughed. As I said, what is unbelievable is safe from public interference, he continued. In modern times, the art of self-provocation has become a part of the world of unbelievable conspiracies, while society is taught not to believe that conspiracies happen. This doesn't change the fact conspiracies are a way of life in the imperial world. Nor does it change the fact the Empire's provocative missile in my hypothetical scenario could have come from us. Of course, it could have been just as easily launched against China or Russia, with the same effect as may yet happen in the shadow of a major conflict. Almost anything can be used as a pretext these days. The preferable pretext is that which is conjured up with lies. The fact is, we are so damn easily provoked, I said to Fred, because we have already lost our soul as a nation. We are told to jump to the prescribed conclusions instantly and charge into battle like an injured bull at the first sign of trouble. That's how we have been trained. I admire the president for not falling into this trap. Of course, the SDI as a global system wouldn't have been that easily shut down, I said to Fred. That may be the real reason why the Empire, more than Russia, wants the SDI shut down. They want it destroyed because future provocations would be prevented when automated defense systems are in place that can't be easily deactivated. The Imperials claim to be our friend, but deep in their heart they want us eliminated. Hiring the Soviets to do this for them would be their style. But the time hasn't come for that yet, Fred interrupted. The empire that we serve will keep us around as their pet for as long as we are useful for their goal of taking over the world. But not for 1 minute longer, I interjected. Remember Franklin Roosevelt? He had made it quite clear before he died that the British Empire, together with every other empire, would be dismantled after World War II. The empire that was still a major force didn't allow this threat to be carried out, nor will it allow this threat to be repeated. And it won't be repeated, considering the way the American people have been destroyed from within as human beings. We have become a small people. The Imperials, even those within the USA, have acted precisely like the Venetian Empire had acted after its near defeat by the Renaissance forces in 1509, said Fred. The Venetians had staged a cultural war that destroyed their European society from within. After that they stood back and watched the shooting wars to begin that were launched by the people themselves against one another, which the Venetians had prepared the ground for. Those shooting wars lasted for 80 years, Peter, in which half the population of Europe was killed. That is how effective the cultural warfare had been that started it all. In today's world we have the same happening again, set in motion by the same empire, except the destruction of humanity is reaching deeper this time. The fascism of greed has become the most powerful cultural warfare force that has ever been created. Adam Smith should be congratulated for this. The resulting shooting wars will likely last longer and be vastly more murderous if mankind survives them at all. My point is that we've been dragged into a permanent war situation that has already been raging for decades, and we have become masters in fighting this war against ourselves without even knowing that the war is on. For as long as we do this, the Venetians of today won't see us as a threat. They keep us as their pet and use us to keep the rest of the world from developing its humanity. Of course, if we step out of line and even talk about a new renaissance, we'll be eliminated, I interjected. You must be mistaken, I heard Ross say, who had come onto the balcony. What's all this talk about the Venetian Empire? The Venetian Empire fell apart on its own, he said, and laughed. That's what everybody says. And the British Empire no longer exists. What empire then are you talking about? If anybody is an empire, we are it. The Venetian Empire didn't fall apart at all, Fred replied, and smiled. It transposed itself northward, and became the British Empire. I thought you knew that. Didn't you study history, as I suggested you should? The Venetian oligarchy brought with it its fear of the Renaissance and its ability to manipulate other people in support of its goals. that empire still exists as a private financial empire, as it has from the beginning. It owns nearly all of the central banks in the world. It's a financier empire, like the Venetians have been, and it is an empire that's in a state of permanent war with the whole of humanity in order to prevent mankind from asserting its humanity that would shut the very notion of empire down. That is why permanent cultural war is on the agenda instead of permanent economic development. The empire has been fighting to stop the SDI for this reason, to prevent a new economic renaissance erupting around the world. Sure, the SDI would make any future self-provocation harder, but their main concern is to prevent a new renaissance from erupting around the world through scientific and technological progress. They were successful in preventing Russia from participating. This stopped some of their fears. By us giving it up totally, the empire's fear of a new renaissance would be lowered even further. I am telling you this because I want you to understand how important your mission is. If the mission succeeds, it might buy us a little time, Fred added, but it won't be a victory. The real victory lies somewhere else. We have to eradicate the empire through the back door by way of an asynchronous movement that takes the fight out of their court to a higher platform that they do not control. But until then we are locked into their court and into their permanent warfare games. This means keeping the heat down by all means possible until the real solution is won. Fred explained that the empire's fears are justified because America did have the economic and political capacity in the post-war period to do what Roosevelt had intended, to eliminate every empire on the planet and free the nations of the world from even the smallest remaining vestige of colonialism and empire. He was committed to industrialize the whole world and end poverty and the slavery that poverty invites, said Fred. Some people insist that Roosevelt was killed for this reason, to prevent the final termination of the concept of empire on one planet, which would have happened. Stalin may have sensed that. He was sure that Roosevelt died from imperial causes of the usual sort. He insisted that Roosevelt's death had been arranged somehow. He suggested that he was poisoned. No evidence exists to support this claim. However, today's empire won't allow us to be ever again in a position to threaten its existence technologically, economically, or even militarily, Fred concluded. The imperials will get rid of us long before that happens, and Russia and China, too. The SDI was designed to prevent this someday. But it is not operational now, and the imperials won't allow it to become, so this means we have to find a new flank. They told us last night that they mean business. You can bet your life they'll destroy our country long before the SDI ever becomes a viable defensive system if we don't comply. They'll destroy the SDI together with all of us. They will have to do this to save themselves. That's why we have to shut the SDI down, quietly, by ourselves, in order to save us from the effects of their fear. We have to do this before they launch a major provocation that would end our existence altogether. They illustrated to us last night that they have the means to do it. That is what last night was all about. The president doesn't know that, nor could he understand it, but we have a perfect opportunity at this moment, because of his shortcoming, to eliminate the provocation that the imperials have staged against us. The president's fear of Russia is our opportunity now. He gave us a golden opportunity to buy us a little time. This means that we must be successful, Pete. We must shut the SDI down as a gift to Russia in order to quiet the fears of the imperials that run the whole show on both sides and fear a new renaissance. We have to go this route until the empire, as an institution, can be dissolved and swept away in a real and global renaissance that lies beyond their tentacles and their brains, to recognize an asymmetric renaissance. That is also the reason why it must be you guys who go to Venice, and I mean all of you. Because no person in the world must ever find out the real reason why we are doing this. It's ironic, isn't it? Said Ross, that we must destroy the only technological defense we can possibly have. We must destroy our defense in order to remain safe. He almost laughed in a mocking kind of way. We make ourselves feel safe by remaining vulnerable, I said, and laughed with him. We should have our head examined. Fred nodded slightly. Only God knows for how long the little interlude of peace with the Empire will last. That our gift to Russia might buy us. Will it last a year, a week, or a day? I told Fred that the safest thing would be for humanity to dismantle its military might and rebuild itself as human beings in the way America once did under the leadership of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. That seems far out of sight now, said Fred. We've been in the Empire's clutches ever since our country was formed, with only a few rare exceptions. Roosevelt was such an exception, and Lincoln, and a few others. Apart from this, every time we didn't watch out we fell deeper into the imperial trap. We were lured into their deepest trap by Adam Smith and Bertrand Russell. Are you telling me that last night's near destruction of the world was in fact the gift of Adam Smith? Said Ross. He looked at me, stunned, then at Fred. Fred shook his head as if in disbelief that this question was asked. Didn't I tell you guys to study history? He said to Ross again, but looking also at me. I almost begged you, haven't I? You can't understand what happened last night without understanding history, and I mean the real history of mankind. How did you come to this conclusion? Ross asked Fred. I answered for Fred. I related to Fred what Jason had brought up at the pub and how it related to Helen's lateral lattice of the oneness of humanity. I pointed out how the minds of a nation can be so poisoned that their humanity, which people are naturally aware of under normal circumstances, becomes shifted totally out of sight. War unfolds in this environment, I said to him. It is a part of it. War unfolds in a world in which the natural unity of humanity has been pushed out of sight, either by ignorance or by malicious intervention, or both. That's where Adam Smith comes in, doesn't he? Jason had reminded me that Adam Smith had been commissioned to devise ways for destroying the United States of America from within long before it even became a nation. That's what he delivered in the service of his master, the second Earl of Shelburne, the man who ran the British Empire at the time of the American Revolution. Jason had told us on the beach that the British wanted their colonies back. Since they didn't succeed on the battlefield, they used Adam Smith's methods. The first was free trade. When this was defeated by Alexander Hamilton, they tried again. Adam Smith's second weapon was applied, and it worked. His cleverly hidden destructive system of greed-based fascism was taken in, like the Trojan horse. It was hailed, raised up, and celebrated as the golden pinnacle of modern economics. But it remained what it was, a weapon to destroy society. The weapon succeeded splendidly, as the Imperials might have put it. I pointed out to Fred and Ross that this was in essence what Jason had said to us on the beach during the air show days in Vancouver, and later again in a pub. Adam Smith was commissioned for this during the famous carriage ride in 1763, Fred interjected. I should call it the infamous carriage ride of Adam Smith with Shelburne, in the year in which the British East India Company, that Shelburne controlled at the time, became a private world empire. The Imperials had staged the 7 Years' War to achieve the status of empire. The East India Company was their front organization. But that is only where the end game begins. If you only focus on that, you miss the beginning. That is why you don't know what last night's incident was all about. So, I must tell you again, you haven't studied history, as I told you. And that goes for both of you. That is why you really don't understand anything. You keep telling me in so many ways that you find the real movements behind last night's attack basically unbelievable. This proves that you both know nothing. Of course, I don't blame you. There are not many people left in the world that understand real history, whom you can learn from. Fred sighed and shook his head. So I must tell you myself what you need to know, he said. If you had studied the universal history of mankind, Fred continued, standing before us now like a schoolteacher, then you would have instantly understood what the cruise missile incident was a part of. You would have understood that this isn't about Russia or America, or even about the Cold War standoff. This is about empire. War has always been about empire. That's going back about 3,000 years to Solon of Athens, the great reformer. Solon was a threat to the very idea of empire. He introduced the principle of the general welfare to uplift the whole of society. He gave the common citizen some dignity and taxed the rich in support of society as a complete entity. That's the basic principle that our country was founded on in modern times. Our general welfare principle, one of the key elements in our Constitution, came from Solon of Athens. We learn from history that for the last 3,000 years the world has been in a state of near permanent war, that is carried out for one purpose only: to suppress this principle, to wipe it out, to get it out of the minds of humanity. The principle of the general welfare wasn't allowed to remain alive in Athens past the death of Solon. This profound idea, as weak as it still was, stood in the way of the process of empire. A process was underway at this time to form an alliance between the king of Macedon and the Persian Empire in order to create a vast empire of the entire Mediterranean region. The design was that the resulting empire would be shared by the king of Macedon and the Persian emperor. But Greece stood in the way, and more so did the idea of the general welfare that opposed the process of empire and invalidated it at its very core. The Peloponnesian War was set up to correct that. It was designed to eliminate Greece as a dominant factor in the Mediterranean. For this purpose the Big War was designed to become a permanent war, a war that was not designed to be won, but to grind this region into the ground. Greece was successfully destroyed by this war. While Pericles, who ruled Athens after Solon, stood at the center of this imperial madness, the orchestration came from the Persian Empire. Pericles carried out the destruction of Athens, and with it the destruction of the Greek classical culture, but the blueprint for this madness did not come from Greece. What happened there wasn't rooted in the culture of Greece. The Persian wars in the region necessitated a defensive league to be formed that was run by Athens as the strongest of the city-states, which quickly set the stage for Athens to develop imperial ambitions, and with it sink the region into the perpetual type of warfare that the Peloponnesian War became, a war that ground on from small beginnings for almost 70 years, spreading havoc across the entire region. Pericles conveniently served as a pawn to carry out the imperial plan for permanent war, and he was excellent at it. His sophistry was the best. It was the sophist's sophist, second to none. His sophistry would be mimicked many times through the ages, and still is so to the very day. In this sense the Peloponnesian War became the blueprint for modern permanent war. Pericles was the architect of the process that defeated Solon's principle of the general welfare, and with it the underlying principle of sovereignty. Without knowing it, he carried out the destruction of Greece in order to make way for the greater Persian Empire. Since Pericles died in his own war, he didn't see the outcome of his efforts, with Athens being totally defeated. Ironically, the entire destructive madness turned out to be in vain, since the plan for the greater Persian Empire didn't work out either. Even Alexander couldn't do it, the renowned military genius, the then king of Macedon. With the full backing of the Academy of Athens, Alexander defeated the Persian Empire and built his own empire on its ashes, which extended from Egypt across Persia all the way into northeastern India. In Persia he was called Alexander the Cursed, as he burned the capital and the National Library. In India he was called Alexander the Great, as he represented a new light in the darkness of the Brahmanic Dark Age. At the height of his greatness, Alexander was poisoned by Aristotle, which left the entire scene in chaos, and opened to the emergence of Rome as an aspiring imperial force. From around 200 BCE on, Rome began to move into the direction of empire. Rome hadn't been an empire by design, but a republic, though it seems that the intention was always there for empire that gradually became the dominant force. The transition in Rome to empire was facilitated through civil wars and other wars in the Mediterranean, in a grand rivalry between Egypt, the Middle East, and Rome, of course. At first, there was a compromise arranged between Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, but that didn't work out. Julius was killed. Mark Antony then tried to marry Cleopatra, but they both got defeated when the heir of Julius Caesar made a deal with the forces in the Middle East, and wiped out the forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and became emperor, the Emperor Augustus. Thus, the warfare around the world was always about empire. The permanent drive for empire necessitated the reality of permanent war. The Roman imperial system was also at war internally, by which it decayed from within. The Emperor Diocletian had divided the empire into two parts, an eastern and western division of the empire, just as had once been planned at the time of Philip of Macedon in conjunction with the Persian Empire. But again it didn't work out. The western part of Rome collapsed. The medieval period began, in which the empires were defined by an emerging new phase of empire, the phase of the financier oligarchy, that is still the primary force of empire today. The financial empire platform emerged with the Venetian financier oligarchy that took over Byzantium in the east, the old Eastern Roman Empire. The Venetians also became linked with the Normans in the north. Some suggest that the Venetians created the Normans out of the Norse background and the background of the Vikings. Eventually the two imperial forces, Venice and its stooges, ran the major shows throughout the Middle Ages, maintained by the force of permanent war. With the rule of empire comes permanent war, Fred continued. You can't have one without the other. Some of the wars are known today as the Crusades, and in some books as the Norman conquests. The method, though, was permanent war in order to prevent the natural development of humanity. This destructive process continued until the general collapse of the entire private financier empire apparatus in the 14th century. The financial system simply collapsed. From the ashes of this horrible collapse, that ended with the Black Death plague sweeping across Europe, the Golden Renaissance emerged as a recovery process that suddenly became possible. The Golden Renaissance emerged as the opposite platform to empire. It created a new kind of society that was modeled after the general welfare principle that Solon had pioneered before Pericles wrecked it, that Socrates and Plato had represented again in their time. Plato's Republic became the new model for a true nation-state society. The Council of Florence brought much of that into being. That's what started the very first modern nation-state, a society based on the principle of the general welfare. Louis XI of France was the first to implement it. There was a man at Louis Court, by the name of Richmond, who took the idea to England. On the basis of the new model, he ousted the decadent King Richard III, and established in England the second modern nation-state, a state committed to the principle of the general welfare that Solon had pioneered. But the empire platform had remained alive in the background. The vestiges of the old imperial interests had retained considerable power, especially the Venetian end of it. With the redevelopment of this power, a new phase of permanent war began, the wars defined by the modern empire versus the platform of the modern nation-state. The old imperial interests consequently tried to break up the nation-state idea. They tried it at first with religious war. The first assault on humanity of this type began in 1492, with the expulsion of the Jews in Spain, and the institution of the Spanish Inquisition that redefined the meaning of bestiality. Europe became a sea of permanent war that raged on until 1648, when the Peace of Westphalia re-established the platform of sovereignty that stands behind the nation-state idea, which also had its roots in Solon and Plato. However, the imperial song hadn't been eliminated totally with the Treaty of Westphalia. A new imperial force was quickly cobbled together out of the old Venetian background. That became the Anglo-Dutch Liberal Empire, that combined forces with the prominent imperial revival in India via the Anglo-Dutch India Companies. The idea of liberalism really means liberty in looting. Enslavement, to wage war, a kind of liberty from the principle of humanity. Free trade became a part of that liberty. It meant freedom from fairness in trade. In order to establish themselves as a full-fledged empire, the Anglo-Dutch Venetian imperials organized another, permanent, war throughout the continent of Europe. That became the 7 Years' War, from which the British East India Company emerged as an imperial power acknowledged in 1763 in the Treaty of Paris. That marked the beginning of the British Empire, the first completely private world empire in history. That was also the time when the oppression of the American colonies began, and the imperial oppression against the people of Europe. In the background of this unfolding regression into a new dark age, an international alliance developed that brought together the leading intellectual and moral forces of Europe, and those in North America, typified by Benjamin Franklin. The end result was the formation of a new nation-state, as a full republic, without the lightest concession to imperial tradition. That's how America became a nation built on the two key principles that came out of ancient Greece, pioneered by Solon, Socrates, and Plato, the principle of the general welfare, and the principle of sovereignty. Of course, the imperial establishment in Europe was alarmed by this trend in America that was admired throughout the world. In order to stop even the chance of these principles from ever coming to the foreground again anywhere in the world, the intellectual background of Europe, where the development began, was decimated in another string of permanent warfare. This new string of permanent war started with the French Revolution, which the British had orchestrated, followed by the unleashing of Napoleon, that destroyed much of Europe, in over 20 wars. This permanent war process was also imported into America through the channels of the slaveholder society in the American South, via long-standing imperial links that organized the Confederacy of the British slaveholder faction into war. Abraham Lincoln understood that he was facing permanent war, unless a decisive victory could be won. And it was won at a huge cost, but the nation survived. From this victory, the United States emerged as the greatest influential power on the planet, built on the general welfare principle and the principle of the sovereignty of nations and individuals as human beings. The ideas that the United States and its economy represented, which came out of Europe initially from ancient Greece, spread back into Europe, especially into Germany. The Bismarck reforms in the late 1800s were modeled after the principles that were pioneered in the USA. The same happened in Japan. The reforms in Japan started Japan on the road to becoming an industrial society. The same development began also in Russia under Alexander III. We saw the development of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. The industrialization of Russia was happening. Similar developments began in many other parts of the world. Thus, the very thing happened all over the world that the British Empire had tried to prevent. The empire saw itself suddenly placed in jeopardy because the nations of Europe, Asia, and increasingly in the Americas were erupting into a cultural revolt against the platform of empire. The world suddenly became development-oriented. The nations became agro-industrial powers committed to freeing their people from the imperial conditions of serfdom, slavery, and hopeless poverty. This sounds like a fairy tale in today's world, Ross interrupted. Development has become a bad word. Fighting poverty is no longer on the agenda. We are on the fast track of exploiting poverty for profit. And slavery is bigger than ever. It's here to stay. It's the driver behind globalization. Don't get so uptight, Ross, said Fred. What you're complaining about started in the 1800s when America gave the world a new breath of freedom and prosperity through economic development. The remaining bastion of empire, led by the imperial forces in Britain, organized a new phase of permanent war. It started with World War I that launched the brutalizing of humanity anew. This trend has been escalating ever since. When society recovered to some degree from World War I, the imperials quickly started the ball rolling towards the next World War. They acted quickly before President Franklin Roosevelt, who understood the game, who represented the American tradition, was inaugurated, who might have saved Europe from World War II. The traitors against humanity acted with lightning speed. They brought Hitler into power a single month before Roosevelt's inauguration, thereby pushing Germany past the point of no return. Franklin Roosevelt was a genius in many regards, Fred continued. He would have saved Europe from the effects of the World War I depression, just as he saved America from the effects of the Hoover Depression. However, he was a genius only to the extent that he had the two great principles of civilization in his pocket, the principle of the general welfare and the principle of the universal sovereignty of people and nations. He was a genius in that he utilized those principles that had been pioneered in the Greek classical era, that the USA had originally been founded on. He utilized the foundation of classical humanism that had rescued mankind several times in the past. With these principles, Franklin Roosevelt staged the greatest economic development the world had ever seen. He turned a depressed nation into the greatest economic and moral power in the world. If Hitler had not been pushed into office with imperial financing, the humanist principles that transformed America would have transformed Eurasia in the same manner. Instead, Eurasia was destroyed and turned into a wasteland under the imperial doctrine of permanent war. While the Roosevelt economic development in the United States saved the world from Hitler, the ideas of fascism and empire, which are actually the same, had not been defeated in the process of winning World War II, said Fred. Fascism had survived and continued to be promoted to the point that it nearly defeated America. Our enemy isn't Russia, Peter, or communism, or even the British/Venetian Empire that had staged the last two world wars. Our enemy is the notion of empire that breeds fascism, and its outcome, which is always permanent war. Permanent war is a doctrine of empire, and in modern times this has become a cultural war. This cultural war, like every permanent war, is not designed to be won, but to go on and on as long as possible to thereby grind the humanist spirit of society into the ground. Russia was defeated in a similar manner, said Fred. Russia was defeated with communism that was developed in the imperial workshops of Palmerston and Urquhart of the British Empire. Communism had been designed as a Trojan horse. The horse was successfully delivered to Russia by Karl Marx. Communism was designed as a cultural warfare process to accomplish in Russia from within what Napoleon had not been able to achieve on the battlefield. Thus, the imperial objective remained the same in both cases, permanent war and permanent fascism, to grind the humanist spirit of society into the ground. Where Napoleon failed, Karl Marx became successful. I think you missed one important item of history, I said to Fred, interrupting his long and no less amazing speech, as I saw it. You missed one item of history that placed America at the center of the longest period of peace in modern time, from about 1866 to 1911. In this 45-year period, no major wars had ravished the world. It was as if the train of horrors had suddenly ground to a halt in 1866. The forces of empire were defeated in the American Civil War that ended in 1865. Slavery was abolished in the USA. The British Opium War against China had ended a few years earlier. The Spanish Inquisition was finally terminated just prior to this time frame, after a reign of terror lasting nearly 400 years, with the burning of people at the stake numbering into the tens of thousands. From then on, the world remained quiet, until after 1911, when the train of horrors was restarted that hasn't stopped since. This 45-year period of peace coincides with the years of discovery in America of the divine principle of scientific mental healing by a New England woman named Mary Baker Eddy, followed by the years of its science being developed and promoted by her and its being widely practiced throughout the land and in some parts of the world. After her death in 1910, her science quickly eroded, and its world protective influence with it. All of this is a part of American history, and the history of mankind. Her revolutionary concept of God is rather simple, according to the way Steve described it. She recognized God as being holy and corporeal, defined as mind and spirit, and so on, which renders man and the universe as the corporealized expressions of it, reflecting its harmonizing principle and a spirit that is love, in our spirit and in our love, and with the power of discovered universal principles. With this perception, she raised the status of man miles above the level of the sewer that the masters of empire have dragged society into. She raised mankind up to the highest level of Renaissance yet imagined, from which a flood of remarkable healing flowed. This, too, is a part of mankind's universal history, Fred. It happened. A peace happened that ended war, without a gun being fired. After her death in December 1910, The permanent war of empire resumed and has not ended to the present day. The missile that you observed last night, Peter, was an element of this permanent war of empire against mankind, said Fred. All facets of war are elements of the war of empire, for which the nations are used as bonds, and as the suppliers of the resources for it. Empire typically uses many nations for its games. It was by design that last night's missile was flying right over the top of our tracking station undetected by technological means. Some of the Empire's stooges of permanent war had disabled the detection system to achieve the maximum terror effect. The missile that you saw was probably intended to fly right across Washington, D.C. likewise undetected, right in front of our nose, and then go on to erase Baltimore. The resulting terror effect would have been so great that it would have destroyed our nation from within overnight. No one would have felt safe anywhere after that. In this chaos it would have been easy to create a police-state dictatorship, for which the reins would have been placed into the hands of empire, quietly. At this moment the nation-state principle would have ended. It might have ended sovereignty right across the world, and relegated the principles of civilization to the ashbin of history, for a long time to come, together with every other facet of our humanity that opposes the platform of empire. We are in a war, Peter, said Fred. But we are not in a war with Russia or the Soviets. We are in a war with the platform of empire. We are in this permanent war that is not designed to be won, but is designed to grind the humanist spirit of society into the ground. Yes, we have the physical capacity, as human beings, to dismantle all atomic bombs in the world in a week. It's a simple technical process, but it won't happen until this permanent war is won. To win this war means defeating the platform of empire as an idea. This can only be done with a higher idea that stands miles above the philosophical lies that support the platform of empire. We need a platform of truth, something that is substantial, like light eradicating darkness. There is no substance in empire. No principle exists that supports it. It can exist only in the shadow of permanent war. It is darkness, and darkness has no substance. There is substance only in light, in the light of our humanity. That is what I hope we will bring to the conference in Venice, the light of our common humanity that banishes this empire darkness. This shouldn't be too hard to do, interjected Tony. The battle, as you just described it, is so fundamentally uneven, with us having the upper hand, that there is no real contest happening. Is there? Fred turned to me and laughed, pointing to the oil slick that was barely visible by then. The speck of oil out there on the ocean has a 3,000-year history standing behind it of mankind closing its mental horizon to the obvious. You can't understand what the oil speck is all about until you understand this vast scene of universal history. The empire is doing all it has in its power to prevent you from understanding this history. And to some degree, you fell for it. That is why you are pointing your finger towards Russia, as the imperial masters want you to, whereby they prevent you, and us all, from doing what is right. Instead of scrapping the SDI, we should be scrapping the platform of empire. Of course, we won't really be scrapping the SDI idea in Venice, because the core idea behind it was never implemented. One can't scrap what hasn't been implemented. The core idea was for the entire world to come together and cooperatively develop the SDI system as a science driver for global development, and then secondarily to provide for the common defense of all mankind. This idea was never allowed to be implemented, as it goes against the very grain of empire. The SDI was doomed from the start. Society had become the supporter of empire instead of civilization. From the moment the SDI was put on the public agenda, it became an empty shell, if not another tool, in the advancing process of permanent war. So it's easy to commit oneself to scrapping this empty skeleton, Peter, but it won't be easy to convince anyone in Venice of what has killed the real SDI in the first place, and what stands behind the process that killed it, the process of permanent war. Society is not allowed to recognize the cultural war that is in progress against its humanity under the auspices of empire. The Cold War, Peter, is really a cultural war, War against the culture of humanity and civilization, a permanent war of empire fought on the platform of fascist greed against the principles of the general welfare and the principle of the sovereignty of the human being. This hidden permanent war has been proven more effective, Peter, for the presently ruling empire than World War I and II had been, combined. This modern war also promises to be vastly more destructive once the world financial system disintegrates that has become an empty shell under the permanent warfare doctrine of fascist greed. The effect of this financial and economic collapse will be global, and will be vastly worse than the horrid collapse in 1345 that brought on the Black Plague, by which half of Europe perished. Yes, Adam Smith was a part of the war against humanity, that we are in the midst of it right now, said Fred. This means that last night's cruise missile thing has nothing much to do with the Soviets directly. The root for our modern war was planted in 1763, 20 years before the American Revolution, and 150 years before communism was foisted on Russia. I believe Shelburne was the British Foreign Minister in 1763, while also being the operational chief of the East India Company that became the first completely private world empire in 1763. No doubt he helped direct the Paris Peace Treaty, that was essentially an imperial show in which the various empires of the time divided up the world among themselves. Lord Shelburne's East India Company got a large share of it. America became a part of its hunting ground. Unfortunately for Shelburne, America was already becoming rebellious then. This might have been the reason why Shelburne commissioned one of his East India Company's scribblers by the name of Adam Smith during a carriage ride in 1763 to produce an apologia for free trade that could be used as an imperial weapon against rebellious North American colonies. He also gave Smith a second commission, as you already know, to study the collapse of the Roman Empire that might be deployed as an imperial weapon for the destruction of a targeted nation. We are told that Adam Smith completed some of the work a dozen years later under the title, The Wealth of Nations. Ironically, and perhaps by intent, this completion was handed to Shelburne in the year in which the American Declaration of Independence was signed. Are you aware of this timing, Ross? Said Fred. He looked at both of us. Can you see a connection now unfolding that takes the permanent war doctrine all the way back to the Peloponnesian War that was staged to kill the humanist principles of Solon of Athens and the principle of the general welfare and that of the universal sovereignty of the human being? Solon's ideas are deeply reflected in the principle of our federal constitution. Shelburne's attack on America through Adam Smith was Shelburne's opening salvo in his modern Peloponnesian War. Can you see that this war is still ongoing? Can you see how it is defeating us just as the Peloponnesian War defeated Athens, the great cultural pillar of ancient Greece? Fred paused and smiled. Shelburne's model for the British Empire, of course, was Venice. Venice had dealt with what had remained of Rome and Istanbul, he added. As Ross pointed out, Shelburne commissioned Adam Smith to research the decline and fall of the Roman Empire for that reason. The discovery of the strap was important to Shelburne. It wasn't that he wanted to prevent the historic folly from being repeated. He wanted to use the process as a method for war in a targeted manner to destroy other nations that denounce empire as a form of government, as the American colonies were doing in seeking their independence. It turned out that Shelburne needed Adam Smith's weapon. His empire's war on the battlefield to stop America's independence went badly. The British got bogged down and then lost. Thus, the battle cry for Shelburne's coveted New Rome became free trade, a Adam Smith style, the poisoned art that Shelburne had commissioned earlier. Shelburne managed to make himself prime minister for 1 year to implement his free trade poisoned art personally. The survival of his empire hung in the balance. America could not be allowed to exist. No nation was allowed to prosper independent of the empire. In his capacity as Prime Minister of Britain, Shelburne stood before the House of Lords in 1783, after the shooting war with America had been lost, and argued for a peace treaty with America that he could use as a conveyor belt to impose free trade on the American Republic. Since America couldn't be defeated on the battlefield, as he might have suspected, he had those other means at his disposal, fully prepared, with which this could be done. Thus the poison dart was launched to kill America from within, Venetian style. One way or another, America had to be defeated, as he saw it, or colonialism would be doomed. Indeed, the empire would be doomed. Losing the American colonies was one thing, but if the breath of freedom were allowed to flow out from America and touch other colonial people, the end of colonialism would have been the outcome. Shelburne couldn't allow that. Wasn't Shelburne's free trade poison dart imposed, as you say, on France as well? Ross interrupted. France had been America's best European ally during its independence fight. Yes, and France was punished for it with the guillotine, I interjected. The French responded differently than Hamilton had responded. Shelburne's free trade wrecking operation had been exposed in America in 1787 in Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Papers. The debates that followed resulted in the U.S. Constitution. In 1789, the Constitution became a formidable armor against those kinds of poisoned darts. France didn't have that protection. It had a monarchy that became an easy target once free trade had wrecked the country. Adam Smith was evidently far more than just an ordinary scribbler of the East India Company, Fred continued. He was a clever, black-lord genius who understood the principle of economics and the measures that can be taken to prevent it from being applied in a targeted country. Free trade was launched as a perfectly disguised method for accomplishing this goal. Smith didn't invent free trade, of course. The idea of people freely trading with each other on an equitable basis is as ancient as civilization. Adam Smith only invented the method by which it could be used as a poison dart, meaning trade free of fairness. That's economic warfare. The free trade dart thus became Shelburne's spear to hit America with, to dump British imports into our country. It was done in order to prevent our own manufacturing from developing. I am sure there were not many people of Adam Smith's caliber around in the world who understood the principles involved. Hamilton was one of the few. He instigated tariffs that protected America's fledgling industry and saved the nation. Ross burst out into laughter. What Shelburne had struggled so hard to foist on us, which Hamilton had rescued us from, we now impose on ourselves. We promote slavery around the world, give it free trade status, and wreck our industries with it. Hamilton understood this as attack on the principle of economics and protected America, said Fred. The King of France wasn't among those that understood the principle of economics. He became overwhelmed by the attack and lost his head as the result of it. Of course he did, Ross interjected. Instead of protecting himself behind a wall of broadly based humanist development that would have given a new life to the nation, as our founding fathers had done in America, the French king exposed himself as a fool. He got himself locked into empiricism, for which the whole nation and all of Europe eventually paid an extremely steep price. I think it was the second defeat of Shelburne's empire that freaked Shelburne out the most. When free trade was shut down in America, I commented. Shelburne was so freaked out about that, especially that France had supported the American independence fight, that he launched this rage of a preemptive attack against France, for which he staged the French Revolution. His rage was out of fear that the Europeans' elite might be supporting the quest for freedom elsewhere in the world. Indeed, the American independence battle would probably not have succeeded had it not been for the significant logistical and ideological support of the American independence movement that came from France and also from Spain. Shelburne was in an apparent rage over this, determined to eradicate this dangerous movement against empire. He acted accordingly, instigating the French Revolution through his agent Jeremy Bentham. The revolution itself was actually of little importance to him. It was only needed to provide the cover for eliminating France's scientific and humanist elite. The unspoken goal was to prevent the real revolution that he feared, a Renaissance revolution sweeping across the world that would be nourished out of the same European intellectual background that had nourished the American Revolution. To prevent this Renaissance from erupting globally, Shelburne needed permanent war. Tragically, France obliged him. This war has never really stopped. After the French Revolution was defeated, and Napoleon was likewise defeated later on, the platform of empire as a form of government was nevertheless reaffirmed at the Congress of Vienna. Thus the people of Europe were never allowed to have a true nation-state republic to the present day. To this day, America remains the only nation-state republic in the world. It stands as a pioneering model that has never been applied anywhere. That is why Europe is in no shape to truly defend itself against the platform of empire. It will always remain a lackey, an underling to empire, unless America acts and shuts down the whole idea of empire once and for all. That's the only way we can get ourselves and Europe out from under the mantle of permanent war in service of empire. Aren't you overstating your case by a long way? Heather interrupted Fred. We haven't been in a state of permanent war for a long time. We have seen a few minor skirmishes, but not permanent war. Most modern wars are fought without guns, said Fred. Those are the most deadly ones, and the Imperials are becoming ever more efficient in staging their Cold War, or silent war operations. Shelburne's covert attack on France began in 1789, the same year in which the U.S. Constitution was enacted, said Fred. Actually, it began 2 months before the Constitution was signed into law. However, as far as I know, not a single British soldier was involved in this war. It was all done cold style, in cold blood through the back door. Actually, their Cold War operations were rather crude in those early days. Shelburne's war against the European Renaissance began with the storming of the Bastille prison in Paris. Shelburne had experience in staging that kind of backdoor war in the form of a riot. He had previously instigated the Lord Gordon riots in London, in which a bunch of Protestant rebels stormed Westminster. For 8 days London had been ransacked. In the process of this experiment, the Newgate prison was overrun. The rebels had been freeing all the prisoners, who had been promptly joined the rebels' assault on the Parliament buildings. Shelburne's subsequent Jacobin insurrection in Paris, 10 years later, followed the same mode of warfare. It began like an exact replay of the London affair, except it was designed to be carried out on a vastly larger scale. It was designed right from the start to become a reign of terror that could be continued for several years. It quickly became an endless massacre in which the intellectual elite of France was systematically murdered. French hands, manning French guillotines, carried out the treachery, but the hands were guided from behind the scene by Shelburne strings through the channels and the workshops of Jeremy Bentham. Even the renowned revolutionary leaders, like Marat, Danton, and Robespierre, are said to have been all on the payroll of Shelburne's East India Company. Some of the records of payments may still be on file in the British Museum. Together with those payments, the revolutionaries also received the Bentham-produced ideological darts for their fiery oratories, the poison gift bestowed on them by Shelburne's covert operations chief himself, Jeremy Bentham. In true Venetian style, Danton and Robespierre were later executed by the terror organization that they themselves had helped to create with the stream of Bentham poison. They might have been executed as a means for eliminating them as a liability to the empire. Once the planned killing had been done, the French nation was allowed to emerge as a republic briefly, for which the revolution has been officially staged. However, this republic would soon have a man by the name of Napoleon as its president, who quickly made himself emperor and dutifully carried forward the Jacobins' rampage of terror all across Europe. Napoleon? Ross repeated, and laughed. Which one? Both of them, Bonaparte and Louis Napoleon III, Fred replied. Napoleon Bonaparte was the first to play the Jacobins' game. He played it big in style as the infamous man of war, the man of 22 battles, the invader of Russia. In 1812, where over 500,000 soldiers died. Napoleon Bonaparte was a fascist at heart, But Louis Napoleon was worse. He was groomed from the outset as a British asset. He was an inmate of Palmerston Zoo, the zoo of Lord Palmerston, the new ruler of the British Empire. Louis Napoleon, having been originally employed by the British as a special constable, was sent by the British to Paris in 1848 after the so-called Little French Revolution. Louis Napoleon was deployed there for his name, the name Napoleon, and set up to become president of the once again new republic in 1851. And he did become president. Of course, in being true to the Napoleonic tradition, as soon as he had established himself, he promptly organized a coup d'etat in 1852, by which he became Emperor of France, like his predecessor. Thus he became the historic role model for all the fascist dictators to come in the 20th century. Ross applauded. But what are you trying to tell me, Fred, with this line of exploration? Are you saying that you see a connection between this part of history and what is happening today? Are you saying that we are stuck in a hidden form of an ongoing perpetual war? Precisely, Ross, said Fred. The British Empire has perfected this art of hidden perpetual war. It has become a largely cultural war now, Venetian style, but much more advanced than what the Venetians could have imagined. Why are you guys talking about the British Empire, and the French Revolution, and the Venetians? Sylvia interrupted. She had overheard us talking, and joined us on the balcony. As far as I can tell, this has nothing to do with the task at hand. We are dealing with Russia, with the Soviet Union. You are wrong, Fred countered her gently. Russia is the smallest item in what we are dealing with. The biggest item is Venice, and I mean the old historic Venetian Empire. Britain was a small player before 1688, before the Dutch Prince Orange, a Venetian asset, invaded England. He brought the Venetian-style world imperial ambition and corruption with him. The invasion of Britain by Orange the Venetian stooge became the greatest tragedy in recent history. We are still suffering from the resulting tragedy, a tragedy of conspiracies to control the world that are still ongoing. Russia is a secondary player. Russia got dragged into this game. Russia's communism is an imperial creation. Karl Marx, the creator of communism, was ideologically guided by the Palmerston crowd, especially by Palmerston's top agent David Urquhart. Communism was foisted on Russia. It was the empire's Trojan horse, a custom-made poison dart to bring down Russia. The poison dart was designed to destroy Russia from within. It hasn't quite succeeded yet. Nevertheless, Russia is still controlled by the empire through the back door. That is why Russia is secondary. So, it is the ancient Venetian mentality then that we will be dealing with in Venice, said Heather to Fred. Fred nodded. Maybe not quite the really ancient Venetian mentality, but the derivative that came out of it. That's how Adam Smith comes into play as a creature of that mentality. He is the link why we are going to give up the SDI. Adam Smith created the modern poison dart that staged the modern American empire ambition. The poison dart is greed-based fascism. That's Smith's masterpiece. Adam Smith is hailed in America as the god of modern economics. What he is hailed for is the empire's gift to America, the empire's Trojan horse, that we took, and people say that America has become an empire. That's not true, Sylvia. He pointed to Sylvia. We are not an empire and never will be, but we've been overrun by people who dream of us being an empire, while in reality we are but lackeys to the imperial masters that are quietly hidden in the British Venetian background. The perpetual war that we've been duped into fighting against our nation and mankind is run through the back door. It's a war of fascism powered by greed. That's Adam Smith's poison dart. We are destroying our industries with it more powerfully than any bombing campaign could have accomplished. We are doing it all ourselves under the post-industrial society doctrine, which is just a small element of the cultural war that has been unleashed under the doctrine of this poison dart. The latest operation in this perpetual war is named Cultural Freedom. It was initiated in 1951 in Berlin with a CIA offensive called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Since culture is freedom, the hidden goal is to promote freedom from culture, which means the destruction of civilization. We are still linked into this war. We are presently destroying our financial system with Adam Smith's design for a total war on civilization. We are also destroying our cultural assets, including our scientific and technological culture, and humanist education, that every advanced culture depends on. It's all being taken down, especially science. We use science now to vilify the achievements of science. It started with the CFC ban, and the DDT ban. We use science to kill people on a massive scale, by abusing science to disable these life-protecting achievements of science. These kinds of assaults on mankind's infrastructures for living are presently killing millions of people each year. We are also duped by empire into using our financial power against us. We are, for example, in the process of destroying our transportation infrastructures by withholding the funding required to maintain them. We are doing the same with our water management infrastructures, and our power infrastructures, healthcare infrastructures, and so forth. And not only do we refuse to maintain those infrastructures, we sell what we've got to the pirates that demand a king's ransom for the few services that are still provided. And even that is not the worst. We are also locked in a war of destroying the very image of the human being itself, rendering mankind as a villain on the earth. The global warming doctrine is a part of that perpetual cultural war. The blueprint of this war calls for a global assault on fossil fuel energy utilization on which civilization totally depends, at least until nuclear power is fully developed, which is presently being sabotaged at every turn along the way. And yes, as if the resulting vast destruction was not enough, we are also dragged into the occasional shooting war as well. The shooting wars are imposed to draw people's attention away from the hidden wars, the real wars. Ross nodded momentarily, then shook his head. You think this isn't true, because Adam Smith died in 1790, Fred responded to Ross. Sure, Adam Smith died long before his poison dart hit America, and scored a deeper wound than Smith could have possibly imagined. I know that Adam Smith died 2 years after Shelburne's attack on France began. But he was well aware of what was planned, and was about to happen. He had a close working relationship with Jeremy Bentham. He would have had to be blind and deaf not to recognize the direction into which everything was being pushed. Naturally, one won't find any mentioning of that in the history books. I have studied a lot of them. Still, the evidence certainly is there. The coincidence is obvious, is it not? There is no doubt in my mind that Adam Smith was a man of stature. Nor do I harbor any illusion about there being many people of equal stature found in our modern world that have the capacity to recognize Smith's second poison dart for what it is. But who even dares to do it? Who dares to point to Smith's fascism of greed dart and identify it as an attack tool for cultural warfare to demobilize civilization? It took someone, like Hamilton, to do this, who had recognized Smith's free trade poison dart in his days, which was more easily recognizable, and then rallied people against it. But people with this kind of combination of wisdom and daring are rare. That's why greed-based fascism, misnamed economics, still rules, and its poison is destroying us. I see no political parties fighting in this war on the side of humanity to shut it down. There is no one standing in the hustings fighting for a new world. Who even realizes that a war is going on? Ross shook his head again. Seriously, Ross, where are the patriots standing in the hustings? Said Fred. Who even knows anymore what the hustings are? Where are the intellectuals standing at the street corners educating the public? This healing movement hasn't begun yet. It probably won't begin until we start it. That's why greed-based fascism still rules, and the end of the nuclear war game playing isn't even in sight. I am sure that my friend Helen would concur with Adam Smith, I interrupted Fred. She would have agreed that if one wants to destroy a nation, one will have to shut it down on the inside. One will have to prevent the universal chaos from unfolding at every chance that one gets. Once this is done, the rest falls apart on its own. Sure, said Fred. What Shelburne's Jacobin mob did in France, Adam Smith did afterwards with greed-based economics in the United States and virtually everywhere around the world where the modern empire has its wars going. Adam Smith authorized the greedy to steal. He freed the criminals and put them into positions of power. That still happens in our world. Our little episode last night, which nearly destroyed the world, was probably just a minute part of that still ongoing larger war, said Heather. Obviously, this Adam Smith understood that if one destroys the foundation for the universal kiss, one sets up the stage for a universal war, added Heather. The universal kiss? Fred repeated questioningly. What is everyone talking about? Is this something I should know? Since Fred was unfamiliar with the concept, I explained in a rough outline that Helen recognizes humanity as a universal construct in which all mankind is bound to each other in a lateral bond of love that reflects our individual love for our humanity, the humanity that we all share, the love for which, if it is honest, extends to all mankind in a lateral fashion from heart to heart. Helen recognizes that this love for our common humanity has three elements. One element is manifest in universal economic development, which she defines as the element of our joy. Another element is manifest as the development of science, which she defines the element of our power. The third element is manifest as the universal kiss, so to speak, which she defines as the element of our peace. The principle of universal love is an active impetus that stands behind all three elements. Its most profound outcome is what might be described as our universal kiss. I love her concept of the universal kiss, said Heather. It reflects the natural unity of mankind. Aren't we all being human beings with a common humanity and a common universal, divine soul? I suggested to Fred that we need all three elements for civilization to stand tall, or to stand at all. I suggested that any photographer would confirm that if one destroys a single leg of a tripod, the tripod falls down. I suggested to Fred that it didn't really matter which leg one destroys, the end result would always be the same. That's what Adam Smith understood, I said to Fred. Adam Smith destroyed the universal kiss with greed, thereby blinding society to its very soul. The economic collapse was secondary, and so was the collapse of science. The tripod fell down. The end result, when this happens, is always war in terms that bring down civilization. War results when our humanity falls to the ground. The Imperials know this, and make good use of the process. That is why we are fighting the Empire's wars today against our own civilization. Society has been drawn into the process. The Imperials drained us of our humanity and turned us into stooges to their fascism. But why do we comply? War has basically no other purpose than to protect the empire from civilization, the effects of which would eradicate the very notion of empire, answered Fred. Perpetual war is the Imperial Strategic Defense Initiative. It's their SDI. It is also used as a cover-up to hide the empire's inner bankruptcy. We comply because we haven't created our own strategic defense initiative yet, our own humanist SDI, which we might deploy to defend our humanity. That's the principle of universal love, I interrupted Fred. The fact that we haven't started on our humanist SDI yet is the root of the Cold War, said Fred, and applauded me. Russia had little to do with that. Can't you see this? It is more accurate to say that Bertrand Russell started the Cold War. The Soviets are as much a target of his reign of terror ideology as we are. Russell proposed the nuclear bomb long before there was one, and proposed that it be used as a terror weapon to force the whole of mankind under the umbrella of a single imperial world government or feudal dictatorship. Then there would be peace, he suggested. But the reality is that peace by terror is perpetual war. This original Russellite policy actually still stands, Peter. The nukes that he lobbied for were built, and they were built for their potential to terrorize mankind into compliance with the demands of empire. That's why last night's near destruction of the world was but another facet of Adam Smith's war against humanity, said Ross. That's a part of the imperial outlook that Russell admired, isn't it? It is no secret that Russell had lobbied for the atomic bomb as a means of forcing a world empire dictatorship on humanity. It's obvious, isn't it, that the further we move away from the universal cause, the more horrible will the manifests of war become. I interjected. Does anyone agree with that? Fred agreed. He even suggested that World War I and II were really Adam Smith's atomic wars in this context. It was always about protecting the empire of greed against an unfolding renaissance of universal economic development. We need the humanist SDI to defend ourselves against the madness of empire and its unleashing ever more forms of war. And more than this, we need a Renaissance SDI to defend ourselves against the climatic cooling of the coming return of the Ice Age. Perhaps that should be our real mission in Venice, I interjected, to start a strategic defense initiative to defend humanity against the dynamics of the natural changes in their universe. This means that we are not scrapping the SDI idea as such, but are setting the stage for a much larger one, that all mankind takes part in, one by which the very notion of empire ends. By which also the name Adam Smith vanishes from the horizon, and what it signifies, added Heather. But first we have to attach the name to every permanent fascist war, said Ross. His name still rules and his war is still raging, though the man has been dead for over 100 years. Isn't it about time that this ends? Except, you can't say anything like that at the conference in Venice, Fred cautioned me. Adam Smith is revered universally. If you were to speak against Adam Smith, you'd be regarded as a fool? Our whole project would then be in danger. Without the scientific foundation that we have just reviewed, nobody can recognize Adam Smith's greed-based fascism as a covert cultural warfare instrument. Alexander Hamilton might have understood this without too much of an explanation, but the empire killed him for it preemptively. That's how the empire operates. You certainly can't link the surrendering of the SDI with Adam Smith at the conference of the physicists. You can't even say that we are giving the SDI to Russia as a gift in an effort to disable to some degree Adam Smith's imperial poisoned art that causes perpetual war. You can't say such a thing, even if it is true. Nobody at the conference will be able to understand what Adam Smith has done to mankind, and is still doing, though he is long dead. You don't have time to teach universal history. You have to present your case the hard way, Pete. Neither should you talk about your favorite subject, the principle of universal love, even if it is the core principle of civilization. You would be speaking an unfamiliar language. The imperials of the world made sure that the language of the principle of universal love has become lost a long time ago. You'll be facing a tough uphill battle, Pete. Nevertheless, I expect you to win. And how is that going to happen? I countered him. You just spent an hour teaching us history, illustrating that perpetual war is the outcome of empire, especially the modern cultural warfare part of it that Adam Smith has evidently pioneered, and then you are telling us that none of us can even talk about it. What the heck do you expect us to do? This crisis needs to be healed. We can't just go there and do nothing. Scrapping the SDI doesn't count as an active process. The healing requires the action of an active universal principle, something positive with power in a developmental way. But you say, don't. Fred shook his head. I'm not saying that, Peter. I am merely saying that you can't attack this challenge through the front door. The front door is watched. You have to attack this through the back door. That's how you handled the cruise missile incidents last night. Tony didn't go through the chain of command. That step would have failed. There wasn't time to go through the front door. Time wasn't on your side last night. But you did the right thing. You pried open the back door and promoted Dagmar to general. The case was solved before the chain of command was fully powered up. The way you guys proceeded was an example of leadership. If you would act like that again, you would win in Venice too. I'm counting on that you do. Just don't expect me to dictate to you what steps you must take. Fred looked at his watch when he said this, then looked up at Ross and Heather, and smiled, and began waving his arms about. You must get your stuff together, and quickly, he said loud enough for also Sylvia to hear him, who was inside in the house. Fred spoke in as loud tone of voice as a town crier might, speaking in his heavy Spanish accent, grinning from ear to ear, loud enough for everyone to hear him. "Get ready, people, or I'll be threatening to come along as your valet," he said. "The float plane should be here any minute." He repeated the last sentence twice. He still grinned and laughed when Ross and Heather left us standing on the balcony in an evident rush to get a few things together. "Valet of what?" I replied, and began to laugh myself. "We have to go in our work clothes, just as we are. It'll take an hour to go back to camp and change. Also, we'll have to go without passports, money, credit cards, and ID papers. It's all locked up back at camp in the truck. Maybe you should come along, Fred, as our liaison, to vouch for us." Fred looked at me and burst into laughter. He laughed as if nothing more serious had transpired during our entire conversation, at the railing than being engaged in some small talk looking out across the water at an oil slick that was barely visible by then, and making jokes about it. "Don't worry," said Fred quietly, "you'll be given everything that you need. It will be ready for you when you get to Berlin."